There we go. Okay, wonderful. I'll do this up. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us here in person, as well as those of you joining us on Zoom. Those of you on Zoom, I wish I had a camera to show you the set of cookies that are out in the hallway. They're quite glorious and spectacular looking. I encourage folks to grab some if you want. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Dave Feldman. I'm the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies in Jones College of Education and Human Services, and this is now the first session of the year and the fourth session in this series on evidence-based practice in graduate education. We've been bringing in speakers to come and share with us their research and their practice. If something that said catches your attention, A, I think there's a good reason for that, and B, there are papers online, and these recordings from each of these sessions will be available on the Grad Studies website off of the College of Education main page, probably starting next week. Again, this will be the fourth in that series. Our speaker today is Dr. Rachel Friedenson. She's an associate professor from St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. And in my personal view, her work is quite extraordinary. I said to some of my students in lab meetings today that first time I encountered her work, I sat there and said, "That's the paper that I would have loved to have written." And so now I don't need to do it because she's doing it and doing it better. So with that very minimal introduction, I'm going to hand the microphone over, and I will be monitoring the chat from a separate Zoom connection. So we're going to ask, I think, to save questions until the end, but we'll have some time for Q&A. Also, I will mention now and remind you also at the end, for folks who are able to join us in person. So this talk will run until 1 o'clock. Starting at 2 o'clock upstairs, there will be a round table. So for people who want to chat more, who are interested in issues of implementation, or if you just have follow-up conversation you want to have, please join us there. There will be more refreshments there, not just cookies, but other things as well. So extra incentive. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you actually came to see Dr. Rachel Friedenson.
Thank you so much. I'm going to see if I can pin this to me. Does it work?
Yep.
Excellent. And I'm going to put this in my pocket so I don't drop it, because I'm a really like gremlin-handed person when I'm talking. So I will knock things over. Hi, I am so happy to be here. I'm so excited. I did not intend to start my talk off like this, but now I want to. Who in here is a graduate student? Oh, good chunk of graduate students in the middle. Professors, faculty members. Oh, big chunk of you. My goodness. Any administrators? Oh, amazing. Okay. Amazing. That's great. So I'm excited to talk to all of you in your different groups about the roles and tools of power, re-envisioning doctoral advising. And I'm going to say this research is in STEM, but I will connect the dots to other places at the end. Nope, that did not work. That did not advance the slide. Go. Great, I figured it out. So before I get started, I just really want to say a bunch of thank yous. Thank you to Dr. David Feldman for inviting me and those really kind words. To Amber Summers Graham and Brandy Spackman for helping me make my travel plans. And Amber picked me up at the shuttle stop in a golf cart yesterday, and it was amazing. I felt very important. Dr. Genia Betancourt at University of Memphis is my co-author and co-researcher in all of this. So when I say we, it's not the royal we, it's me and Jeannie. And also Megan Bartlett, who is one of my former master's students from St. Cloud State. She works in and lives in Washington State now. So all of these we's are actually multiple people, not just me and myself talking. and of course, St. Cloud State University, because it is my academic home right now. And they funded this research through an early career grant that was really generous and made it very possible. I'm gonna try not to ramble, but I'm gonna introduce myself a little bit in terms of who I am now and who I have been in various phases of my life. Now, I'm a higher education researcher and an associate professor of higher education and student affairs, which basically means I do all college all the time. I teach and work in one, I research higher ed, and I think about it pretty much nonstop, which is fairly stressful. And for this project, one of my particular roles that I started thinking about the minute I got the job and haven't stopped thinking about it till this moment is that I'm a current graduate advisor. We have an EDD, a Doctorate of Education program, and I advise a multitude of dissertators and pre-dissertators and students in their EDD work. And I think it was the part of my job that I was the least prepared for. And I think that that's pretty common, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But one of the reasons that this is thinking about doctoral advising in STEM is because when I went to college 20 years ago, I was a physics major, and I was going to be a physicist. I was going to be an astrophysicist. And I ended up being somebody who I would now describe as a STEM leaver. In 1997, Seymour and Hewitt did this foundational study about why students, particularly undergraduate students, switch out of STEM fields. And they pointed to a lot of stuff like pedagogy and culture and climate. And it was all true for me. And added on that, I cannot do multivariable calculus. And so I became a history major. I have a master's degree in history, medieval history, no less. And then I grew out of that a little bit and went and got my PhD in higher ed because I really wanted to think about these structural experiences that I had both in college and my master's degree in this broader way. Also, for the purposes of this work, I describe myself as a supported doctoral advisee. A lot of times when I say I research power and graduate advising, people are just like, oh, is it because you had a really bad experience, which is pretty common. And no, I had an awesome experience. It was awesome. My PhD advisor is one of my good friends and mentors to this day. And I think that that's in part why I was really driven to do this work, because so many people do not have the experience that I had. And I even, as you'll see, this research hinges on participants who switched doctoral advisors during their PhD programs. I actually did switch. I got switched in a piece of maybe what was administrative retaliation against my first advisor. Great that this is recorded. And so I actually had this experience that I can share with these participants where I started out on one trajectory with one person and I ended up on this different trajectory with this different person, not because I necessarily wanted to, though it was awesome in the outcomes, but because it happened to me. So this is all the background for why I think a lot about doctoral advising in general. And now some background of the actual study. So I think as people who have graduate degrees or are getting graduate degrees, we all know that advisors play a really central role in graduate education broadly and doctoral education specifically. Particularly, Weidman has been talking about socialization for decades now, but particularly the role in socializing students to a discipline or a field of study, in helping them establish senses of self-efficacy, particularly in research, and in establishing a sense of belonging as somebody who can be in grad school, who is a scientist, who is a doctoral person, blah, blah, blah. And doctoral advisors provide this support across the entire lifespan of a doctoral program. And it can cover all sorts of ranges of things, from training and development. Finances is a significant role that they play, particularly in STEM, and even emotional and mental support and things like that. And I'll add, when I'm talking about STEM and I'm saying advisor, there's a lot of different terminology. People will say supervisor or PI or chair. I'm talking about anybody who is in that sort of top role for a student, and has control both over their professional life and their academic life. So it's usually also chair of the dissertation committee. However, we know that doctoral advisors are super important, and there is very little information about how to do it out there. There's very few like best practices, and we can problematize the idea of best practices as much as we want, but they're very few and far between. And most Fulgens found that most doctoral advisors learn on the job. They learn by imitating, or they advise by imitating their advisors, for better or for worse. And they also often use trial and error. So they're just like, well, I got this student, let's try this out. And then if it doesn't work, they're like, oh, okay, let's do something else. And one of the reasons, something I get from a lot of reviewers when we're sending our work out is, why STEM? And I'm just like, oh, why not? But it's also, it's the things that I talk about that happen in STEM do happen in pretty much every other discipline and field. Like, this is not a STEM specific thing, but it is a little bit ramped up. So STEM fields really tend to emphasize individualism and competition, even in like labs and collaborative spaces. And this is, again, not to say that the humanities don't, but it gets a little bit different, and students perceive it more. And they also, students tend to look at their advisor for more informal and formal support, more than students in other disciplines. And I think because there's a great deal more money and attention for STEM fields, when things go particularly wrong, we tend to hear about it a little bit more. So we know, I've been tracking stories for probably at least 10 years, thinking about research and media and anecdotal messaging, like through whisper networks, about experiences that students have of overt, this is not the covert, this is overt sexism, racism, harassment, assault, and other forms of marginalization in STEM fields. Now, this is not all advisors, and advisors are not responsible for all of the general terrible things that can happen, but they do end up often playing a role if they're not sort of directly implicated in it. They can be perpetrating some sort of terrible practices. They can ignore it if and when they see it, which is they're not being active bystanders. And they can choose at times not to support those experiencing it. And all of these can add into marginalization and ultimately attrition out of STEM for a lot of students. People will leave their doctoral programs, they will leave the fields, they will leave academia. And from an institutional standpoint, attrition is never good. We want to keep people, there's some money in wrapped up in this. And from a sort of academic standpoint, why are we standing between people and their dreams? And we're losing a lot of talent and brilliant ideas and work that could be done when this happens. So to look at this, I wanted to think about power. And power is a little hard to latch on to in a research study, particularly as a social scientist. We tend to be a little narrow. So I used a combination of frameworks. One is this power conscious framework developed by Chris Linder at the other Utah institution. And And honestly, her work is brilliant. She writes about sexual assault policies on college campuses. It's a very different set of circumstances that we're talking about, but this really helps put into sort of operationalization the way that I see power functioning. I have to admit, for those of you who will get this joke, I'm a post-structuralist, I see power everywhere. But it can be really like diffuse and it's hard to grab onto. So the power conscious framework, or PCF for short, is located on a couple assumptions. One is that power is omnipresent. It is everywhere all the time. You can't really remove yourself from it. It is inextricably linked to identity, and identities are socially constructed. And so this is where we can get into talking about things like racism and sexism and many other isms, because it's tying power to social identity. Who has it, who doesn't, who does a specific policy benefit and who does it not benefit. And then because the PCF is really focused on action and change, Linder offers 6 pillars that we will return to, but very quickly it covers critical consciousness, self-reflection, history, context, change behaviors. Let's see if I can remember and not look at my notes. Attention and standing in solidarity with those who speak out. And she's really thinking about ways to change practice and policy. And we're going to come back to this. So this is how we establish that power is working, that if we are conscious of power, it works in these specific ways in this foundation. It's tied to social identity. It's tied to material reality. And if we want to change power, we probably need to think about these 6 things. And then for our study, we wanted to, okay, that's about the size that I wanted it to be when I stuck this in here. We wanted to think about individuals, how to manage the very broad nature of power and the very individual impacts of power. So we used Urie Bronfenbrenner's very classic ecological model of development. And what he really wanted to think about was how individuals are embedded in and develop within social systems, because we don't develop alone. And so he developed multiple layers for, say, an individual student. So there's the micro system, which is those interpersonal relationships that happen in specific spaces, like home, school. The coffee shop can be a micro system, church, other places. The mesosystem, that middle layer, which I think is one of my favorite layers, is where those micro interactions tend to interact. So if we're thinking about higher education, the university is this mesosystem where all of these micro places like classes and labs and interactions with faculty members, other students interact with each other. So we're thinking departments, programs, and just it's a little bit broader than the micro. The exosystem starts getting out into the big world. So this is where we get messages about who can be in STEM and who can't be, who is a scientist and who isn't, what is the role of a faculty member. These are all sort of broader systemic things. And then we get to the macro system, the biggest, which are cultural beliefs, widely shared values, and really big discourses that impact. And then we have these fun little arrows about how they interact with each other. So it's not just that there's this like big world that's just impacting one individual, it gets mediated through these layers. And this all helps us think about actual power in advising relationships. And we ended up thinking about the advisor switching process, or the change of advisors, as a way to think about power in a really fine-grained lens, I think is probably a bad metaphor. So we really wanted to see these micro and meso level relationships. Like, we're not super, in general, I am very interested in larger cultural ideas about race, gender, STEM, science, inclusion, etc. But in this case, we really wanted to be that one-on-one relationship between advisors and students, the lab as a space where things happen. And we also wanted to see both formal and informal manifestations of power. So both processes and what happens when you're having a conversation or answering an email from your advisor, which if any of you had the similar experience to me, I used to email my advisor and then just like sit and wait for 3 days. And again, he was wonderful. And now I understand what was happening. He had 17 emails that were just sitting, waiting. And we wanted to be able to account for different configurations of relationships, because power is not inherently bad. It's not inherently negative. Some people have awesome experiences with 2 advisors, and I still had to switch in the middle of it. And that was a weird intrusion of power in my life. And some people have really negative experiences. Some people switch multiple times. There's lots of different social identities. So we really wanted to get into that. So when we started thinking about crafting this narrative inquiry qualitative study to think about power, we narrowed in on the advisor switching process as a way to see this in action, to see students navigating these relationships. Oh, and I have to give my usual caveat. Again, reviewers get me on this on a regular basis. This study is actually not about how or even necessarily why students change advisors. Like, none of our papers are about that process. I feel like we probably could write that paper, but I don't want to. It's about these power-laden relationships that, and we just used this idea of talking to people who have changed advisors as a way to access looking at this power and how it functions and how students experience it. This is a student-focused paper. I'm probably talking too much. Oh my goodness. Okay, so our participants. I know I got brought here to talk, but I do want to make sure there's enough time. We also wanted this study to be pretty exploratory. As Dr. Feldman said, I haven't really seen this research done elsewhere either. There's not a ton of research about advising at the graduate level in general, though there's actually more there, since I didn't start it, but concurrently with Jeannie and I starting this project, several other great scholars like Jenny Blaney and Annie Wofford have also been looking at graduate education and advising. It's been very exciting to see it grow. So we wanted to organize this as a fairly exploratory project. So we sampled for participants across a broad swath of the graduate STEM world. We wanted different institutions, different fields, different stages, different identities, because this is it's a common relationship that we can all kind of identify the structures of, but the little bits inside of it are often very different. So we recruited through social media, through national STEM organizations, and through, ultimately, those were actually not great recruitment tools. And so we ended up randomly selecting 20 Research One institutions, both public and private, and emailed STEM organizations and graduate student organizations and STEM graduate student organizations at these institutions to get participants, and that really worked, so that was great. And each participant needed to be in a STEM field, very broadly defined by the NSF. Thankfully, the National Science Foundation has some like remarkably broad definitions of STEM. They needed to be currently enrolled or within 3 years of leaving their PhD program, either successfully or unsuccessfully, at the time of research, which was now actually like 3 years ago, so yikes. and they need to be at least 18 years old. And the criteria that I forgot to put on this slide is that they needed to have changed advisors at least once. I don't know why I didn't include that one. And we ended up with 28 participants who represented, on a fine grained level, multiple fields of study. We aggregated into the sort of broad NSF categorization, so like biological science, mathematics, without getting into the really fine grained differences. 20 of our participants identified as women, 17 identified as white, and we had 4 international students, which I think is probably a little undersampling that population, given the high population of international students in STEM graduate programs. Each student did a semi-structured interview with one of us via Zoom. This was during the pandemic, so definitely everything was via Zoom. And those interviews ranged from about 60 to 90 minutes. I had a couple 2-hour ones because the students really had a lot of feelings. In those interviews, because it was narrative inquiry, we were soliciting information about their general graduate experience at the same time. So we started at the beginning asking them to reconstruct why they chose that program, why they chose that field, how they chose their advisors, their first ones, / if they were chosen for them, their overall experience with graduate school and advising and mentorship, and then the actual change of advisors. We talked about their first advisors, their second advisors, in some cases their third and fourth advisors in these interviews. And then we thematically analyzed them, looking for emergent themes and commonalities and differences across each of the narratives. We initially chose a code book, we constructed a code book drawn from our conceptual framework. So we were looking at the micro and the meso level from Bronfenbrenner. We were looking at points where we noticed like the power being linked to identity from Linder. And it actually didn't super work because it wasn't concrete enough to be like, oh yeah, power, it's right here. And so we turned to the field of communication, which is very exciting. And Guerrero et al.'s work about categorizing power in interpersonal relationship and communication. And so what this, as a sort of analytical tool, helped us do was make these connections between what our participants were actually saying and then our bigger frameworks about how power works in graduate advising. In terms of trustworthiness, oh, look at my watch, okay. Each participant chose their pseudonyms, and then we did a lot of anonymization across the interviews because being a graduate student is vulnerable and a little precarious, or a lot precarious. And we didn't want any of our participants to feel that their joining this study would in any way hurt their careers. And so like we anonymize fields of study. We don't talk about anybody's specific research or their faculty members' names or their institutions to really protect our participants. And we did a lot of memoing and member checking and our own reflex and thinking about our own power, given that Dr. Betancourt and I are both graduate advisors now. So we thought a lot about our experiences as advisees and advisors. Megan and I, my master's student, and I had a lot of conversation about how we were navigating our power-laden relationship. So it was a lot of reflexive good times. So our findings. The headings in bold are the categorizations offered by Guerrero et al. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those mean and then how they really looked at what they looked like for our participants. So power as resource-based sounds pretty obvious. Advisors tend to have access to resources, and that is money, that is time, particularly the advisor's time, and that guidance and feedback, and opportunity that will be translated into a more material resource later on, like going to conferences as a graduate student, publications, all of those things you need on your CV to be competitive on the job market. And a lot of times, advisors for these participants did not necessarily either acknowledge the differences in the way that they had resources and how that affected their students, or were quite upfront about whether or not students got resources. Laura shared this piece about international students, that international students, because they can't work off campus, they can't really get other jobs due to visa statuses, she said they often end up being 100% supported by the advisor and their grants, which concentrates a lot of their future in that one person. And then that one person can sort of be good about that or not. And resources were also something that students had, and it was a way that they could exert power in their own relationships. Kelly said that my parents are well off enough that if I had to leave, I would be able to. So she very much was able to put that line in the sand to be like, I don't need this. You need me more than I need you right now, because I can do that. But as we know, that is a social identity that's very much based in privilege. She had the privilege of doing that. A lot of people don't. And then in connection with this, power as something that is enabling or disabling. And this is really, if we have advisors with power that is resource-based, this is very much in the way that they use those resources to either enable their students as scientists and as academics and as people, or disable their students to sort of to limit the access to those opportunities. Kara and Susie shared examples of advisors that they felt that were very enabling. Like, it was clear that Kara's advisor was rooting for all of his students to succeed. He was that source of support and encouragement. And Susie said that her advisor said explicitly to all of his students, if I'm not giving you enough support, let me know. He was signaling that he can change the way that he works in order to support those students. And on the flip side, power could be disabling. Jonathan here had a lot of communication issues with one of, I think it was probably his first advisor. And he would say that if he brought up an issue, his advisor wouldn't listen to what he was saying and instead just change the subject. And so that's a way of signaling that there's not support. They don't want you to advance in or beyond this issue or obstacle. Other students talked about whether or not they were allowed to be on papers or present at conferences, how their advisors let them know that they were ready to take these next steps as academics. There was also this idea of power as perception. And this perception was largely the way that students understood the messages about STEM and about STEM culture and academic life that they got from their advisors. I'm going to read Maureen's quote because it is my single favorite quote from the whole data set. The culture at her university kind of believes that if you want to be a physicist, you should want to do physics all the time. And you should be thinking about physics in the shower and when you're eating dinner. And actually, it's pretty inconvenient for you to have a body at all, because then you have to do stuff like sleep and eat, and that's time away from physics. And this was messaging that she got from her advisor and her advisor's students around her. She ultimately changed advisors to somebody who was no less intense, but had a little bit more leeway and was also doing work that Maureen was much more interested in, ultimately. And power was also relational. And this matches up with perception very much in the way that students understood advisors to be able to make decisions about fit and about who was, their kind of science person and who wasn't. And that's ultimately like who can be a scientist and who can't, because you gotta get through this to do that at a certain level. It's not that simple. And so Susie was a really interesting participant because I think she had 3 or 4 advisors. She ended up switching universities. And it's harrowing to read that interview transcript, to be totally honest. And she mentioned she was with this advisor for 6 months, and then he kicked her out of the lab. And he just said, you're not a good fit. and left it at that. He didn't give any more information. She had already come to the lab, started a new research topic over that was more aligned with his focus than hers. And then she learned later that he's known for doing this. He just will bring students in and then dismiss them abruptly. And so it was that relational power, this idea that this one person could sort of decide whether or not you're a good fit. This also tended for many of our students of color to have pretty negative ramifications when they had white advisors. One of our participants, Lillian, who was a Black woman engineer, reported clashing a lot with one of her first advisors, a white woman, basically over this idea of fit, that Lillian didn't do things the way that she wanted them done, the advisor, and she ultimately left and found another advisor. But relational power also happened among students. Again, this is a source of agency for students. Kara mentioned that it took a postdoc in her lab coming to talk to her and to check on her and to be like, do you know that it's not right that he's talking to you this way? To really wake Kara up to like the negative ramifications of this advising relationship she had with an advisor who was very micromanaging, who really expected Kara to do things at the drop of a hat. And her story is that this postdoc came into her office and was like, "Are you okay?" And Kara just cried. And I was like, "Oh, that sounds hard." But so this relational power really was there for students as well, in terms of who they could reach out to, who gave them advice, and how they navigated some of these relationships. And then this idea of power as prerogative, and this was quite frankly one of the harder ones to grapple onto. This idea of prerogative was about basically how advisors could move students along or around. And that's in several different spaces, like thinking physically, like what they're doing in the lab, how they're doing it, but also like along their academic trajectory. Several students expressed that they ended up having to change advisors pretty much at their qualifications stage or their dissertation proposal stage, because the advisor just settled into a stance that they couldn't move forward, and so they ended up changing. For women students in our, I hate to say sample because it's qualitative, but in our participant pool, really experienced a lot of being assigned administrative work or sort of academic housekeeping work. So a lot of them were moved more into a role of like lab manager when they're not supposed to be a lab manager. There are actual lab managers to do that. And like Farnaz says here, things like hosting summer camps and doing something for the advisor's private company, talking to vendors, things that are useful, but don't necessarily contribute towards the professional development of the student and takes them away from their own research. And so this idea of prerogative is that advisors had this power to ask students to do things, and students felt a lack of power to say, no, I need to work on my experiment or my program. And at the same time, this part, what I just said is published already and well developed. This is where my next paper is going, and still a little hazy, is thinking about what students pay when they have these power-laden relationships. And of course, there's always going to be power in these relationships. We can't extract it. And the way that we're thinking about material impact. And so part of it, one of the impacts we found is time and progress. So many of the students, to an extent that I got sidetracked for a little while in a rabbit hole about this, they talked about time and that they had wasted time, or that they had gotten time taken away from them in their doctoral programs because they had to start over. And it wasn't just moving to a new lab and continuing with their research. They often had to restart a research project because they couldn't bring it over, or their new advisor had a slightly different focus that meant that it didn't fit in anymore with the overall work of the lab. And it took a lot of time and energy, and it seemed like they paid for trying to make a better choice for themselves in progress and being able to pursue what they wanted to pursue scientifically. There were also health impacts. A lot of our students talked about mental and physical outcomes from these experiences with their advisors, mostly mental and emotional health. But Jake said it really well. He switched labs. He said, I think I was mentally not fully there in the lab. And I think it really hurt my motivation, because I was just thinking, I got to start over. This has really hurt my work ethic. And I feel that's why I'm not finishing when I want to. So there's this aspect of paying in time, but also paying in the worry and anxiety about that time. Oh no. And then job aspirations. One of the things that we found is that so many of these students don't want to go into academia, and that's fine. Not all of them wanted to go into academia in the first place, but a lot of them started with ambitions to continue in academic science, and then they had these experiences, and now they don't want to. They want to go work in industry. They don't want to be part of this academic enterprise. And I think that's really powerful, as I was pointing to before. When we think about attrition, that's a lot that we're losing from our colleges and universities. I'm going to skip my major takeaways. Power, power is there. It exists. It is fueled by what's happening in the big wide world, and it's being carried out in these one-on-one and small group relationships. We need to rethink how we're concentrating power into the hands of one or two people. Maybe not putting one advisor in control of like the financial and academic and emotional support. And that students exert a lot of agency in their other micro level relationships. So that's the major takeaways. And what I'm going to talk about for the very, very, very quickly in 3 minutes is this idea of how do we go beyond STEM, and how do we go beyond just thinking about when you have a rough time with your first advisor, or your first advisor doesn't get tenure and leaves the university. We had a couple of those in our sample. And thinking about how we can overall intervene in these structures of power. And this is getting back, this is guided by the power conscious framework. And I think some of these are more geared towards faculty members as advisors. Some of these are more geared towards institutional leaders and administrators. But I think it's also very helpful for my group of graduate students in the middle to also think about it, because it offers potential avenues for intervention and change. So thinking things about policy structures, incentive structures, funding structures, and how we distribute opportunities. A lot of times we want to distribute opportunities equally, but that's not necessarily equitably. And how does doing that privilege people who already have privilege at the expense of others? Doing this very, very quickly. Advising practices. This is my favorite slide, and this is what I think about a lot. When we think about meritocracy and how we advise and how we were trained to advise, for faculty members, what do we know about our students, and how are we putting that into action? I think, like number 4, what is my business as usual way of advising? My original business as usual way of advising was forgetting that 95% of my students are working professionals. They don't have all day to spend writing. They have 3 hours on Saturdays. And being able to adjust my advice and my practice along those lines. And I think particularly being an advocate and thinking about ways, it links back to that first slide about policy structures, How do we advocate for a better funding structure, a more equitable funding structure? How do we advocate for training faculty advisors who are not very good at it so they can be good? A lot of times when people, in the experiences our students talked about, a lot of times if there was egregious behavior, that faculty member just didn't advise anybody anymore, which means that everybody else had to do more, which is wild. That's a treat for some people. It's not a punishment. And then when we think in more depth about advocating for students, I think number one is the one that I can kind of end on, is thinking about how can we make transparent the hidden curriculum related to success in doctoral programs? Because a lot of this stems from the fact that we don't tell students how to succeed in doctoral education. We show them through advising and we show them through modeling, but that is hard. And that's also really inefficient. And so how can we make this more transparent across the board for everybody to increase success for everybody, and how whatever success looks like for that student. Oh no. And I will also put in a plug for number 4. And I can also share these slides. I'll send them to Dr. Feldman so you can read these in detail. But how can we integrate voices so faculty members are not the only people making the decisions for students, and how can students advocate for themselves, and how are we going to be good allies for them? You can also find my papers on this topic, or if you would like to contact me, I will happily send them to you. I have them saved in PDFs. We have a new paper coming out soon in the Journal of College Student Development about this topic and meaning making, which is very exciting. I also have all of my references that I talked about in this presentation. And I just talked a lot. Thank you so much. This is how you can find me. And I'm just so happy to share these ideas with you today.
So we do have a few minutes for questions. Those of you here in the room, raise your hand. Folks who are listening online, type this into the chat directly. Please type it into the chat. I will then get into the queue and read on there.
So as I was looking at this, I'm thinking about a student I had who just would not do anything I asked her to do. And I'm thinking, it's maybe not always the advisor. I'm not saying I am, I might be crappy, but also like the student has a role as well, right? So I'm wondering where you think the balance is between sort of our role to sort of weed out the people who maybe got into the PhD and maybe are to. Because sometimes you can't leave them out right, and then the other role of trying to help them.
I can't restate the question.
You don't need to restate it.
I can summarize the question. The question was about what do we do about students who are a little, maybe, let's say, closed off to feedback, resistant, and how do we balance that relationship? I think that is an excellent question that I don't have a great answer to, because I read my transcripts a lot and I think to myself, what would I say to the engineering professor who has $20 million in grants, who's just like, well, the student wasn't good, that it's their fault? And I have not yet figured out a great answer. I think that the answer lies somewhere in having a lot of different support for graduate students to figure out what is going on with them when a problem on either side arises. I think that one of the other issues is that there's not a lot of, so in the student affairs world, I work with a lot of folks who are academic advisors who do like the general advising for undergraduate students. And I kind of think that grad students would benefit from somebody like that, or counselors, because it does happen. they get into a PhD program because they think it's the right next step, and then they maybe don't want to. Or I have had experiences with my own students where they don't necessarily respect who I am, and they don't want to take instruction from whatever they perceive me as. And I think those are really difficult and would really benefit from things like mediation and an ombuds like program, or being able to have a lot of sources of support and choice for graduate students. So maybe they could go work with somebody who they feel better about, or it doesn't become this like life altering thing to leave their graduate program. And I say this as my partner dropped out of her PhD program after 8 years of a tremendous struggle. And we will both gladly say it was the best thing she ever did. It made our lives, like my current existence, possible. And so it's not always bad, but students don't know that. And sometimes you don't want to tell a student that because you don't want them to just like drop out because they're tired. They could be brilliant just having a bad week. But I think that it's in there. I think there's just a lot of avenues that we don't use that we may use on other levels.
Yeah. Two questions. So within the power dynamic, a lot of what we talk about right now is the relationship between the advisor and advisor. Within that power dynamic, the advisor is sometimes having, say, another sort of structure, right? That they're also trying to allay within some respect. And I think, or buffer, right, between the student. Are there mechanisms you've seen or heard within these students leaving that maybe there is a miscommunication between, I have to accomplish this thing for this agency, or institutionally there's this thing, and I'm trying to relay that to you within limited time or context or expertise, whatever it might be. I'm curious about that relationship.
That is a great question. And to sum it up, it was about thinking about the power structures that are sort of overlapping the advising relationship that faculty members, advisors tend to have. Oh gosh, if I knew the answer to that, I could probably make a lot of money. And I think it's really true. And I actually, one of the things that I was really surprised by my data when we finished our interviews is that nobody shared like truly upsetting experiences. Like I talked at the beginning about like sexual assault and harassment. That didn't really happen for the 28 people I interviewed. And everybody was fairly level-headed, except for one of my participants called his first advisor a charlatan. But they were fairly level-headed about why their advisor was behaving in the way that they did. And a lot of it was attributed to this idea of the pressure to get grants and the pressure to produce. And it was another really interesting thing was this idea that if you had an advisor who was on the tenure track and was seeking to get tenure, they were going to be really, really hard. And they weren't going to be great because they had so much pressure. But at the same time, other participants who had tenured faculty were like, no, they're like either working really hard to stay relevant, or they just didn't care what was happening. And it seemed to be no phase of faculty life that was great for students. Which I know. But that is linked to these other power structures, the way that we incentivize production and grant getting, and the way that we fund, and this is a little bit more intense for STEM and maybe for a little bit less intense for humanities because the grant situation is a little different. But the way that we fund these departments and these and faculty members and programs probably needs to shift. If we want to get big into it, I can point to the neoliberal impact of the way that we have turned a public into a private good, which means that everybody needs to get public or private money to make it happen. So I think it's really problematic, and we could see that most clearly. I think there were 2 participants whose advisors left because they didn't get tenure, and that was abrupt and hard. And I remember one of the participants who really liked her first advisor and worked well with her, and her feeling, she was like, I don't understand why they wouldn't tell her 3 years in advance, like why they let it get to this point that she had to leave and mess up this stuff for her other students. So I think that there's like a broad level of systems of change. And I think, again, this idea of ombuds and being able to work out some of these other conflicts that can happen between programs, between faculty members, we could all just sort of like productively handle our feelings. I think everybody would be better off. But it's really challenging. I see your hand.
This is my question. When you say STEM and humanities, where do you put social science?
Oh my gosh, it depends on the social science.
Or where do you put yourself?
Oh, I put myself as a kind of tortured social scientist because I have a really deep humanities background. And the research that I really want to do is much more aligned with a humanities approach, a historical approach, than necessarily sociology or psychology or anthropology. But I think that the social sciences, Ben Baez writes about this really beautifully in several different places. The social sciences tend to align more to the funding structures of STEM fields. And so there's a big, I know in my field of higher education research, there is a big push to get grants. It's not a pressure. Very few of us that I know of are needing to buy out our salary. But I think that could come soon. Like, that's not at all unlikely. And so, and I think the size of the grants is also a big difference. Higher ed doesn't necessarily approach these really big. I think the biggest grants that I tend to see are in the 5 to 10 million range versus the like many millions to do something and have a big lab. But some people get a lot of money. I don't. But I am also not at a research university, so I don't have that pressure as much. And I think the social sciences are just at a point where they need to, some of us might need to decide whether we actually do want to be more like the sciences or more like, maybe not just be our own set of disciplines. That's actually part of my other research. Thinking about disciplines.
I'm going to jump in real quickly, just acknowledge we are at 1 o'clock. Some folks would need to leave conference presentation, so we're welcome to stay and chat a little further if it's of interest. But thank you all again for coming, and keep an eye out for announcements for the December event, which will be Zoom only. So virtual cookies, not real cookies. But please don't feel obligated to leave.
Thank you. Sure.
You mentioned you were talking with your master's students sometimes about the sort of the power dynamics. Did you have frameworks for that, specific questions for that? How did you engage with that? I think sometimes that's useful for us as advisors, but also for advisees to say, these are questions I'd like to ask.
What did we do? I did not have specific questions.
Was there any structure formally that you set up for that?
We did. We set up, when we were first starting to dig into our reflexivity as a group of 3, we each wrote a sort of extensive journal-like memos about our relationships with power. And it was just a delightful experience just to see 3 different people tackle a question, because we had 3 extremely different responses. And so what Megan and I did was read each other's memos, and then, well, all 3 of us did this. And then we had a discussion about it, and there were, and then Megan and I sort of touched base to be like, okay, so we're navigating this, and a lot of the, I think that is fairly obvious. I'm not particularly autocratic. So there was a lot of checking in and being like, okay, is this fine? Do you have too much work? Are you okay with this? And sometimes she would be like, I could honestly use more work. And I'd be like, oh, okay, let me find something. But we would really navigate that. And I think about this a lot with my doctoral advisees, because there are times where I don't think I practice what I've researched. And sometimes I get a little more autocratic, or I'm not really thinking about the distribution of resources and things like that, because I have some students that I gel really well with and some that I don't, and some who are just not interested in me outside of my role as an advisor, which I think is probably one of the other parts about this, is really being able to tap into each other's humanity as both faculty members and students. Like, students are not just cogs in labs, and faculty members are not just there to manage labs. I don't know, maybe we are, I'm not sure. But generally, like, when my students are just like, harkening back to my previous story, when my students are like, why haven't you emailed me back yet? I'm like, well, you emailed me last night at 11 and I was asleep, because that's when I sleep. I am not a late night person. And that sort of, those ideas that like how much of my time is theirs. And sometimes it requires just upfront and uncomfortable conversations, which I don't like doing, but it happens. That was a long and rambling response. Yikes.
I think we're gonna call it there. Friendly reminder, we do have a round table at 2 o'clock. If you're available in the rooms, that will be upstairs in room 209. Thank you again very much, Rachel.
Thank you all. I don't know what's happening now. Should I leave the Zoom?
I'll do that.
Oh, I don't